All right, in this video, we'll be taking a deeper look at the innate defenses. And again, these are defenses that you're born with. They don't target anything specifically, but they kind of just target anything that's not you. And we'll be looking at the cells that run around eat things. Will be called phagocytes. We're looking at inflammatory response. We'll be looking at things, something called interferons, and we'll be looking at fever as well. So first, our phagocytes. There's a phagocyte. Phagocyte literally means a cell that eats stuff, and so that's what it does. These are really big white blood cells. They run around and ingest foreign invaders. They don't really think about what it is. If it's not you, they attack it and eat it. There are two kinds of phagocytes. There are neutrophils, which I don't have a neutrophils. And then these are the most abundant kinds of phagocytes. They usually die in the battle. They die fighting. Um, they become phagocytic on exposure to infectious material. So they're kind of opportunists. When they find something that is not supposed to be there, they eat it and they will die in the attempt. Whereas macrophages, which you see here, macro just means big, these are big eaters. They are the chief phagocytic cells. They're the most robust. They're really big. They run around and they go through tissue and just kind of deal with whatever they find. They're like wandering warriors of the body, and they can live in organs and even in the brain. And they just serve this function of going around finding things that aren't you. And they can initiate that specific defense, which we will talk about later. And so here is this process called phagocytosis, which is just the process of how they eat things. You can kind of see what's going on here. They basically ingest these microorganisms. They create this little vacuole, basically, or a vesicle. This gives it a name. I'm not concerned that you know the name. But basically, what happens is this little bag of bacteria will combine with a lysosome. Remember, lysosomes are in cells to break things down, and then it will slowly break down all of that business. And then some of that business is digest or ex, exocytosis by the cell, and then other pieces of it your body can use to make it your own stuff. All right, so here's the inflammatory response. The inflammatory response is triggered whenever the body's tissues are injured by something. And basically, inflammatory response has to do with swelling and redness and pain, some of the things that we experience when we deal with injury. In any sort of injury, it could be trauma, it could be heat, it could be chemical, microorganism infection. There's any sort of trauma or any sort of inflammation, or inflammation is what the inflammatory response causes. And there's some benefits to this. Basically, what it does is it prevents the spread of these damaging agents. It disposes of cellular debris and the pathogens that are created, from the damage. There's going to be a lot of damaged pieces there, disposes of all that. It alerts the adaptive system as well. So if something needs to be dealt with specifically, it'll find it and it starts the repair process as well. And again, the signs of this are redness, heat, swelling, pain, and there are stages to this, and we can kind of look at this here. And so the different stages of this, basically what's going to happen is um, the, there's an injury, all right, and so then these chemicals are going to be released into this extracellular fluid here, and this these cells that release this chemical are called mast cells, and these mast cells are going to release this chemical, and these chemicals are typically called histamines, which you're familiar with. Histamine, and this is a signal to the other cells to initiate this inflammatory response. And part of that inflammatory response is vasodilation. So you can see here the uh, blood vessels are getting bigger, and also mobilizes the phagocytes, and they will run around and eat things. The neutrophils will go to the area first and deal with the things that are there, and then the macrophages kind of come in and clean up after them. This this next slide actually shows this one that I'm interested in. There's this process called chemotaxis, and basically, how do the neutrophils know and the macrophages know how to get there? Well, this chemotaxis literally means move toward the chemical, and so they will move toward those chemicals that have been released, and they will go and find the problem and deal with the injured area. And just another thing on the inflammatory response, again, any sort of thing can initiate this, and so this could be, something as simple as it always shows like a splinter or a nail. And that's just a straight up nail, but it could be anything. You think of a bee sting, you think of like if you just like smash your, speaking of nails, smash your finger with a hammer, it's going to cause that same sort of response because there's damage, and these those mast cells release that histamine, and it causes that response. All right, next is interferons, and interferons basically are have to do with defenses against viruses. And again, these are innate defenses, so it's not dealing with specific viruses, but cells that are infected by viruses release these interferons, and the interferon serves as a warning to other cells. So here you have a cell that's infected, and it releases these interferons, and this other cell is now going to say, okay, you have some interferons, and that's going to cause this cell to start producing proteins that are going to help deal with those viruses. And so it's like a pre-warning system for other cells that are infected by viruses. And then lastly is fever. Fever is just abnormally high body temperature, and it is a systemic response to invading microorganisms. And the way this works is, again, macrophages. The first thing that happens in any sort of immune response really is macrophage eats the thing that's not you, and that macrophage realizes, hey, this is not you. It releases these chemicals called cytokines, and these cytokines is a generic word basically for any kind of chemical that turns on a process. But specifically, the chemicals that are released here are called pyrogens, which is interesting. Think pyro means fire, so gen means to start, and so they're literally chemicals that start a fire, but it's not an actual fire; it just increases your body temperature. And so basically, these pyrogens interact with this part of your brain, which is your hypothalamus. Remember, hypothalamus receives all the information from the body and then responds to that. It's the main gland of the endocrine system. So it receives that information, and then it causes the body temperature to be raised up. And the purpose of that is basically to burn all the things that aren't you. And so fever is a good thing in that it deals with things that aren't you. Of course, it can, like any sort of thing, just like the inflammatory response for that matter. These sorts of things can get out of control and cause problems, but in general, they are there to help the body deal with things that aren't you, things that shouldn't be there.